The most expensive cruiser in history. Not the largest, not the most powerful, not the most famous. But it was this ship that took a secret of Great Britain and the USSR to the bottom. HMS Edinburgh, a British cruiser, almost 200 meters of steel, 30 guns, a crew of 850, the pride of the Royal Navy. This ship went through it all. Arctic convoys, Norwegian waters, constant threats from above and below. But on one April day in 1942, something went wrong. So wrong that it was kept silent for nearly 40 years. Two nations, official archives, people who knew the truth and took it to their graves. What was on board? Why the silence? And where did it all go later? You will find out in this video. I promise you won't expect this ending. The Arctic, April 1942. Imagine water the color of wet asphalt, a horizon as sharp as a blade, a wind that isn't just cold, it cuts. It cuts through skin, through metal, through thoughts. A ship moves through this water, alone, without escort, at top speed. HMS Edinburgh, a British cruiser, 30 guns, 800 men on board, the pride of the Royal Navy. She is heading home from Murmansk, and every crew member knows one thing: the faster, the better. Here, in the Barents Sea, slowness kills. On the bridge, Admiral Stuart Bonham Carter looks through his binoculars. The water is clear. The sky is clear. Too clear. An experienced sailor knows silence in these waters means nothing. Here, the threat doesn't come with a noise. For several hours, since the moment the cruiser left port, she has been watched. From the air. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane has long since transmitted the coordinates. Somewhere beneath the surface of this black water is a periscope, and a patient man behind it. He has already chosen the angle. He has already placed his finger on the trigger. The clock reads 16:17. Bonham Carter lowers his binoculars. He turns to the navigator. And at that exact moment, the strike. Not an explosion at first. First, a sound. Low, metallic, like a sledgehammer hitting the hull from the inside. Then, a flash in the bow. Then, a list. The torpedo hit exactly in the nose. And this is where the part most people don't know begins. The reason we are here today. Because in the bow of HMS Edinburgh, in a sealed hold, under guard and under the highest seal of secrecy, lay 5.5 tons of gold. Soviet ingots. Payment for weapons. Money that was supposed to change the course of the war. No one on board knew the main secret. No one, except for 3 people. In the next 7 days, this ship will fight its last battle, go to the bottom, and take with it gold that the world would only learn about 40 years later. This is the story of HMS Edinburgh. A story of how war, secrets, and the cold sea created one of the most incredible treasures of the 20th century. And about the people who, decades later, descended into the darkness to find it. But to understand why this ship was so important, we must go back 3 years, to its birth, 1939. Europe does not yet know what real war is. Hitler has already signed the pact with the USSR. Poland is already occupied. But most people on the continent still believe that everything will somehow work out, that there won't be a great war, that they will reach an agreement. At this very time, in a shipyard in Newcastle, they are finishing a ship. On October 16, 1939, HMS Edinburgh officially enters service in the Royal Navy. 6 weeks after Germany and Great Britain declared war on each other. The ship was born into war. From the very beginning, it knew only one thing. Let's get to know her better. Edinburgh was a town-class cruiser, more specifically, the Belfast subclass. This is important. Her sister ship, HMS Belfast, still stands on the Thames today as a museum. You can walk her decks and touch the guns that are designed exactly like those on the Edinburgh. Length, almost 200 meters. Imagine 2 football fields placed end to end. That was the length of this ship. Displacement? About 11,000 tons at full combat load. The weight of roughly 7,000 cars. This entire steel monster accelerated to 32 knots, over 60 kilometers per hour. For a ship of this size, it was like a sports car. Armament. This is where the real talk begins. 12 6-inch main guns. That's a 45-kilogram shell flying 23 kilometers, plus 12 dual-purpose guns against planes and small ships, plus torpedo tubes, plus anti-aircraft guns all around the perimeter, plus 2 seaplanes on a catapult, its own aerial reconnaissance. The Edinburgh was not just a warship, it was a floating fortress. And a crew to match. 850 men. Mechanics, gunners, torpedo men, radio operators, cooks, doctors, officers. A small city on the water. A city that lived by its own laws. Strict, maritime, written in the blood of its predecessors. On board were very young boys, 18, 19 years old. For some, the Edinburgh was their first time at sea. For them, this ship was their first home away from home. From October 1939 to the spring of 1942, the Edinburgh went through it all. Patrolling the North Sea in the first, darkest months of the war, when no one yet understood the rules of the game. Escorting convoys along the Norwegian coast, where enemy aircraft operated almost with impunity. Operations in Iceland, covering the Arctic convoys, the most dangerous sea routes in history. The Arctic convoys. This needs to be mentioned separately. This was the route from Britain and Iceland to Soviet ports, Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Weapons, planes, tanks, food. Everything the USSR received from the Allies under the Lend-Lease program went through here. The route passed by occupied Norway, home to enemy airfields, submarine bases, and heavy ships. Every convoy was a gamble. Water temperature, -2 degrees Celsius. If you fall overboard, you have minutes, not hours, minutes. The crews knew this, and they went anyway. The Edinburgh was part of this system. She guarded cargo, met Soviet ships, and monitored waters where death could come from below, from above, or from the side, all at once. By the spring of 1942, a special atmosphere had formed on board, the kind that only exists among people who live alongside death for a long time. Mutual trust without unnecessary words, black humor as a defense, a habit of the cold, so much so that the sailors no longer noticed the ice-covered railings. The commander, Captain Hugh Faulkner, experienced, tough. One of those who says little, but every word carries weight. This was the ship. These were the people. And in April 1942, the Edinburgh received orders to escort convoy QP-11 from Murmansk to Iceland. A routine order, just like dozens before it. But a few days before departure, something unusual happened in the port. At night, heavy boxes were brought on board. They were taken to the forward hold. No manifest, no official documents, guards with submachine guns. Most of the crew did not see this. Those who did remained silent. But for all the power of this ship, for all the training of its crew, it carried a secret that even half the crew didn't know. And that secret weighed 5.5 tons. To understand where this gold came from, we need to briefly leave the cruiser's deck and move to Moscow, to the hardest year of the war. Moscow, autumn 1941. Enemy troops are 70 kilometers from the city. 70 kilometers is less than the distance from the city center to the airport. It's an hour's drive. It is so close that at night you can see the glow in the west. Stalin did not evacuate. This is important. When everyone expected the leader to abandon the capital, he stayed. And that gesture was worth more than an army. But gestures were not enough. By November 1941, the Soviet army had lost more than 3 million soldiers as prisoners. The industrial regions in the west were occupied. Tanks were burned. Planes destroyed on airfields in the first hours of the war. The country was bleeding out in the literal sense of the word. At that moment, Stalin did what he did best. He began to calculate. To continue the war, you need weapons. Weapons cost money. Money is gold. The USSR had gold. A lot of it. Decades of industrialization were being converted into the country's gold reserves. The question was, how to turn these reserves into tanks and planes. The answer was called Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease program was, simply put, a system by which the US and Great Britain supplied their allies with everything they needed: weapons, equipment, food, fuel, medicine, on credit, or for rent, or as a gift, depending on the interpretation. Politicians still argue about the details, but the details don't interest us right now. What interests us is one specific transaction. In the spring of 1942, the USSR was supposed to make a payment to the Allies. Partial payment for supplies already received. The amount, by various estimates, the equivalent of several £1,000,000 sterling at the prices of that time. By today's standards, hundreds of millions of dollars. It was decided to make the payment in gold. The ingots were prepared at Soviet mints. Each one, standard 11 kilograms, a bit less than a standard gym kettlebell, bright yellow with a stamp. They were packed in wooden boxes reinforced with metal. Each box held several ingots. The boxes were sealed. Documentation was classified. Total, 465 ingots. 5,448 kilograms. 5.5 tons of gold. Imagine a small truck loaded to the brim with lead. That's roughly the weight. Only instead of lead, gold. The cargo was transported to Murmansk at night, under escort. This is where it gets interesting. Murmansk in 1942 was a frontline city. It was bombed regularly. The port operated under constant threat. People lived in a state that is hard to describe if you haven't been there, where the siren sounds so often that you stop reacting to it, where you get used to the smell of burning. In this city, in this port, a convoy of trucks with gold arrives at night. It is loaded onto HMS Edinburgh. How exactly is a story of its own. Almost no official records of the loading process survived, intentionally. Several boxes were carried across the gangway disguised as ordinary cargo. There were guards, but they weren't conspicuous, so as not to attract attention. The boxes were lowered into the forward hold, and the bulkhead was sealed. Captain Faulkner knew. Admiral Bonham Carter knew. A few other high-ranking officers knew. The 850 crew members did not. Think about that for a second. You serve on a ship. You know every corner, every compartment, every smell of the engine room. You think you know what you're carrying. And yet, in the hold beneath your feet, gold worth hundreds of millions of dollars. No one said a word. No one warned them. An order is an order. Was this secrecy justified? Absolutely. In war, information kills as surely as a bullet. Intelligence was active. In ports, in the rear, among allies, informants could be everywhere. However, there was one detail that the command clearly underestimated. Intelligence worked on both sides. On April 28, 1942, HMS Edinburgh left Murmansk as part of convoy QP-11. Several escort destroyers, several transport ships. The weather was bad, which is considered the norm for these latitudes. Force 3 or 4 seas. Visibility was variable. By the next day, April 29th, a plane appeared over the convoy. A Focke-Wulf 200 reconnaissance plane. A large 4-engine machine that sailors called the Condor. It didn't attack. It just flew nearby. High, almost leisurely. It counted the ships, remembered the course. Transmitted the coordinates. On the Edinburgh's bridge, they saw this. The anti-aircraft gunners were ready, but the Condor stayed out of range. Admiral Bonham Carter made a decision. The Edinburgh would separate from the convoy and head forward on its own, at full speed. The logic was clear. The cruiser was faster than the transports and would escape the threat sooner. The decision was reasonable, and at the same time, fatal. Because at that very moment, somewhere in the cold water north of the Norwegian coast, the submarine U-456 received new coordinates. Most of the sailors on board the Edinburgh didn't know what they were carrying, but someone did. And here's the question historians still ask today. Was the hunt for the Edinburgh truly accidental? Or did someone on board play a role in what happened next? There is no answer to this day, but there are facts, and they speak for themselves. U-456 had been moving toward the Edinburgh for several hours. Its commander, Lieutenant Commander Max Martin Teichert, was an experienced submariner. 28 years old, an Iron Cross already in his pocket. Teichert was in no hurry. He was waiting for the perfect angle. The clock reads 1617, April 30th, 1942. The Edinburgh is moving at 21 knots. On the bridge, the usual watch. The horizon is clear. Teichert looks through the periscope. He raises his hand, and the forward hold with the gold is right in the crosshairs. But more on that later, because first, you need to understand one thing. The torpedo that U-456 is about to fire is not just a weapon. It is the beginning of a chain of events that will stretch for 40 years. Through war, through the Cold War, through diplomatic disputes, to a man in a diving suit who, in 1981, will feel cold metal in the darkness and realize that he is holding history in his hands. 1617, April 30th, 1942. Teichert did not miss. The torpedo passed through the water in seconds. For the people on board the Edinburgh, those seconds did not exist. No warning, no sound of approach, just there was a ship. And suddenly, the impact. First, the sound. Not an explosion in the usual sense. A deep, metallic hit, as if a freight train had crashed into the hull from the inside. Then, a flash in the bow. Then, a list to the starboard side. Then, the crash of falling metal, clanging, screams. On the bridge, Admiral Bonham Carter grabbed the railing. The floor vanished from under his feet. In the portholes, only water and smoke. In the engine room, the mechanics didn't immediately understand what had happened. One of them later recalled, it felt like the ship hit something, an iceberg, a mine, anything, just not a torpedo. Because you don't hear a torpedo in advance. It's just there. The first torpedo hit the starboard side in the bow. Let's stop here for a second. The bow. That was exactly where the sealed hold with the gold was located. 465 ingots, packed in wooden boxes. From the point of the torpedo's impact to the gold boxes, only a few bulkheads and a few meters of steel plating. Coincidence? Teichert had no idea about the gold, officially. He aimed where any submariner aims, at the center of the ship's mass, slightly toward the bow, to guaranteed knock out the engines or flood the forward compartments. He hit perfectly. The explosion tore through the forward compartments. Water began to rush in instantly. Arctic, black, ice cold. Damage control parties rushed forward, sealing the bulkheads. This was done quickly. The crew had practiced this scenario hundreds of times. Professionalism against the elements. This time, professionalism won. The Edinburgh was not sinking. She listed, but she held. And then Teichert fired again. The second torpedo hit the stern. This explosion was different, more brutal. The stern was mangled so badly that the steering gear failed instantly. The propeller shafts were deformed. One of the propellers was torn off. The ship, which just moments ago was moving at 21 knots, stopped. Just stopped. In the middle of the Barents Sea. Without steering. With a shattered bow and a destroyed stern. Imagine this moment. 850 men. The Arctic Sea all around. Water. 2 degrees below zero. The nearest shore? Hundreds of kilometers away. And a ship. Wounded. Listing. Helpless. In the engine room at that moment, things happened that not everyone dared to describe later. Steam from ruptured pipes. Darkness. Electricity in many compartments cut out. People moved toward the exits by touch, not knowing if there was even an exit left. But the Edinburgh was not sinking, and this is almost incredible. 2 direct torpedo hits. Forward compartments flooded, stern destroyed, and the ship stays afloat. This says two things. First, town-class ships were built seriously. The designers provided a bulkhead system that allowed the ship to remain buoyant, even with severe damage. Second, the crew acted exemplarily. No panic, no chaos. Bonham Carter assessed the situation quickly. The ship is alive. The people are alive. There are losses, but not catastrophic. The main engines are damaged, but not destroyed. The steering, completely out of order. The order? Move in a circle. It sounds strange, but the logic is simple. Without steering, the ship could only move in a large circle by using the power difference between the left and right engines. Slow, clumsy, but it was movement, not drifting. The escort destroyers arrived. By this time, U-456 had gone deep. Tykert had completed his task and retreated. He considered the Edinburgh doomed. Why risk it? He was wrong. On the destroyers, they quickly assessed the damage. The decision: take the Edinburgh under tow and lead her to Murmansk. It's closer than Iceland. It's a Soviet port with a dock where repairs can be made. Now, a small detail usually overlooked. At that moment, there were 5.5 tons of gold on board the Edinburgh. No one moved it to the destroyers. First, it's physically difficult in the open sea with waves. Second, it's a breach of secrecy. Third, U-456 could surface at any moment, or she could lead other subs to the convoy. The gold remained in the hold. The column moved. Slowly, 8 knots, no more. Tow lines were taut. The Edinburgh under tow was a strange sight. A massive cruiser, helpless as a wounded whale, being pulled by small destroyers. One of the sailors later wrote in a letter home, not sent, found in an archive decades later, that it felt like a funeral. Only the ship hadn't died yet. It just didn't know yet that it would die. They sailed for 2 days. The Barents Sea did not make the task easier. The waves grew. Tow lines snapped and were reattached. The threat of submarines never went away. Meanwhile, in Berlin, they already knew the Edinburgh hadn't been sunk. Aerial reconnaissance found the column again. Again, that same leisurely condor over the horizon. This time, the enemy command decided not to leave the job unfinished. 3 destroyers were sent to intercept. One of them was the Hermann Schoemann, the flagship of the squadron, the pride of the fleet. They were heading toward Bear Island. There, in those waters, everything was to be decided. The lives of 850 men, the fate of 5.5 tons of gold, and the honor of a cruiser that hadn't said its last word. The first torpedo hit exactly in the bow, where the gold lay. Coincidence? Tykert didn't know about the gold. That is the official version. It is most likely true. But here's what's interesting. Intelligence in Murmansk was working, and some documents, declassified in the 90s, hint that information about the cargo might have leaked before the cruiser even left port. It might have. It might not have. Or it leaked, but was too late. We don't know. But we do know what happened next. On May 2nd, 1942, near Bear Island, HMS Edinburgh fought its last battle. And she fought so hard that people still talk about it today. May 2nd, 1942, the Bear Island area. Morning. Gray sky. Visibility is poor. Clumps of fog drift over the water. The waves intensified overnight. Tow lines are stretched to the limit. The Edinburgh is moving slowly. Too slowly. On the bridge, Bonham Carter watches the horizon. Something is wrong. The intuition of an experienced sailor. Not fear, not panic. Just knowing. Cold as the water overboard. At 6:45, silhouettes appeared on the horizon. 3 ships. Destroyers. They moved fast. 30 knots. Sharp bows cutting the waves. The flagship, Hermann Schoemann. Behind her, Z-24 and Z-25. On the bridge of the Schoemann, Captain Karl von Pufendorf looked at the crippled British cruiser. The calculation was simple. 1 damaged cruiser without steering. 3 destroyers in full combat readiness. The balance of power? Clearly in favor of the attackers. Von Pufendorf didn't know one thing. He didn't know exactly who he was dealing with. Bonham Carter gave the order immediately. The escort destroyers, attack, engage them. The Edinburgh, cut the tow lines. Gun readiness, full. Cut the lines. This meant being left without a tow, to be left alone in the open sea, without steering, with a shattered bow and a destroyed stern. Bonham Carter understood this. He gave the order anyway, because a cruiser under tow is a target. A cruiser that moves on its own, even slowly, even in a circle, is a different kind of opponent. The lines were cut. The Edinburgh began its final maneuver. The battle began from several directions at once. British destroyers attacked Z-24 and Z-25, trying to prevent them from getting a clear line of fire on the cruiser. Shells landed in the water all around, throwing up plumes of spray. White, tall, almost beautiful if you didn't know they meant death. And in the center of all this chaos, the Edinburgh. She couldn't go straight. Only in a circle. Slowly, clumsily, like a boxer with broken legs. But the guns were working. Every gun that could still fire. The Edinburgh's gunners were doing what they had trained years for. No panic, with cold precision, aiming guns at a moving target when your own ship is moving in an unpredictable arc is an almost impossible task. They managed. The Hermann Schumann took the first hit at 7:20. A 6-inch shell from the Edinburgh, 45 kilograms of steel and explosives, hit the flagship's engine room. The enemy lost speed. A fire broke out. Then, a second hit. The squadron's flagship was burning in the middle of the Barents Sea. Think about that. A dying cruiser, without steering, with 2 torpedo holes, under tow only hours before, took out the enemy flagship with 2 direct hits from its main battery. That wasn't luck. That was training. That is what you call professionalism, when life, not a career, is on the line. But the battle continued. Z-24 and Z-25, having dealt with the British destroyers, went after the Edinburgh again. They fired torpedoes. Several passed by. The cruiser, with its unpredictable circular motion, dodged some of them. One torpedo hit, in the stern, exactly where there was already a hole. The explosion was brutal. The stern section was deformed so badly it became clear. Further towing was physically impossible. The ship could simply snap in half. The Edinburgh was doomed. Bonham Carter realized this instantly. The order was clear, without hesitation. Evacuate the crew, everyone, immediately, and then scuttle the ship. Because the Edinburgh could not fall into enemy hands. It couldn't. On board were codes, documents, equipment, and the gold. 5.5 tons of Soviet gold, which the enemy, apparently, still didn't know existed. The evacuation took place under fire. British destroyers provided cover, taking men off the Edinburgh. Lifeboats, rope ladders, men jumping into the water, the Arctic, deathly cold water, and swimming to the sides of the destroyers. Most made it. Not all. Of the 850 crew members, 58 died. Some in the initial torpedo attacks, some in the battle, a few in the water. This is called losses, a dry word. Behind it, 58 people, each of whom had a name, a home, and someone waiting for them. Bonham Carter was the last to leave, as dictated by naval tradition. He had been wounded at the start of the battle. A shrapnel shard hit his leg. He was carried to a destroyer. He looked back. The Edinburgh stood in the water, listing, smoking, with a destroyed stern. Her guns were silent now, but she still held on, as if she didn't want to go. Then her own kind stepped in. The British destroyer Foresight fired 2 torpedoes into the Edinburgh's port side. This was standard procedure, to finish off your own ship so it wouldn't go to the enemy. A correct procedure, a necessary one, but no less painful. HMS Edinburgh began to go under. Slowly. She went down slowly, as if with dignity. First the bow. Then the entire forward section vanished under the water. The stern rose. The propellers, bent and broken, emerged into the air for a few seconds. Then they vanished too. The last thing the sailors on the destroyer saw was the masthead light. It stayed lit almost until the very end. Then the water swallowed it too. 7:40 a.m., May 2nd, 1942. HMS Edinburgh went to a depth of 245 meters, along with 465 gold ingots, along with the bodies of those who couldn't be evacuated, along with her history. On the surface, only an oil slick and debris remained. The Hermann Schaumann didn't survive either. 2 destroyers took the crew off the burning flagship. They couldn't allow Soviet ships to pick it up, so they scuttled it themselves. Shot it below the waterline. Thus, near Bear Island, 2 warships, British and German, went to the bottom on the same day. The Edinburgh crew was taken to Murmansk. Bonham Carter treated his wound. In his report, he wrote about the crew's actions with restraint, in a military fashion. The personnel acted with exceptional professionalism in extremely difficult circumstances. It was the highest compliment from a man who didn't know how to speak any other way. Then everyone scattered. The war continued, and the Edinburgh lay on the bottom. 245 meters of cold darkness. Water pressure, 25 atmospheres. Temperature, near zero. No light, no sound. Only quiet, slow decay. And somewhere there, in the flooded forward hold, in the darkness and silt, 465 ingots, yellow, heavy, untouched. Gold doesn't rust. Gold doesn't decay. It just waits. It waited for 39 years. And while it waited, a completely different war was happening on the surface. Not with weapons, with papers, lawyers, and diplomats. A war for the right to go down and take what lay on the bottom. This war proved to be no less complicated in its own way. The war ended in May 1945. Europe lay in ruins, cities destroyed, economies obliterated. Millions of people moved across the continent looking for homes that no longer existed. In this context, 5 tons of gold at the bottom of the Barents Sea was a priority for no one. The people who knew about the cargo remained silent. Some because they were bound by non-disclosure agreements. Some because the war had changed their value system so much that gold seemed like an abstraction compared to what they had seen. Bonham Carter returned to Britain, served his time, retired, died in 1972, taking with him the exact coordinates of the Edinburgh's sinking. Coordinates that were never officially published. Captain Faulkner also remained silent. Soviet representatives who were present at the gold loading in Murmansk were also silent. In the USSR, such things were not spoken of aloud. A state secret was not a figure of speech. It was a way of life. Result: the ship lies on the bottom. The gold lies with it. Coordinates: vaguely known, but not exactly. Legal status: complete uncertainty. This is where the story that usually isn't told begins. After the war, the Edinburgh was given official status as a war grave. This meant the ship was untouchable. The bodies of fallen sailors remained on board. According to British maritime law and international conventions, such a ship is a military memorial. But the gold lay there too. And in this contradiction, between the sanctity of a grave and the value of a cargo, the next 30 years unfolded. The first attempts to find the Edinburgh began in the late 40s. Unofficial, quiet. A few adventurers, armed with approximate coordinates from wartime newspaper articles, tried to organize search expeditions. All hit the same wall: lack of government permission. The British government was silent. The Soviet government was silent loudest of all. Because to admit the existence of gold on board meant admitting much more. Admitting the volume of lend-lease payments. During the Cold War, this was politically impossible. Official Soviet historiography spoke of lend-lease roughly like this. Yes, there was some help. Insignificant. its role greatly exaggerated by Western historians. The gold on the Edinburgh did not fit into this concept at all. Therefore, silence. Meanwhile, underwater, time moved in its own slow way. The Barents Sea is a consistent destroyer. Salt water slowly ate away at wooden structures, paint, rubber seals. The hull, steel, thick, held on. But the wooden boxes holding the gold began to rot immediately. By the mid-50s, almost nothing likely remained of the boxes. The ingots lay in a pile, in the dark, in the silt. Gold didn't react to anything. It just lay there, yellow, heavy, patient. In the 60s, the topic of the Edinburgh began to leak into the press. First, small notes in British newspapers. Then, the first full-fledged articles. By the 70s, the story of the Edinburgh and its gold had become something between a verified fact and an urban legend. Everyone knew the gold was there. No one could get it. And here, one man appears. His name was Jesse Dean. He served on one of the escort destroyers in May 1942. He saw the Edinburgh sink with his own eyes. He remembered the approximate spot where the cruiser went down. Dean was a meticulous man. After the war, he wrote down everything he remembered. Coordinates, approximate, but coordinates nonetheless. Descriptions of weather conditions, the convoy's course, the time the ship sank. He didn't publish these notes. He kept them at home. Dean died in 1974. His notes remained. And here begins the part of the story that most resembles a detective novel. Because Dean's notes somehow, through relatives, through archives, through people professionally interested in the topic, fell into the hands of a man who knew how to work with them. That man was Keith Jessup. Jessup was a British diver and entrepreneur. In the 70s, he specialized in recovering sunken treasures. Not as an adventurer, but as a professional. He had a company, equipment, and experience, and absolute confidence that the Edinburgh could be found. He started work in 1979, not with an expedition, with papers. Because before you descend to a depth of 245 meters, you must get permission from two governments, British and Soviet. Reconcile the legal status of the operation. Determine the division of the recovered gold. This took 2 years. 2 years of negotiations, legal disputes, and diplomatic correspondence. Soviet officials first pretended not to know what he was talking about. Then, that there was no gold there. Then, that even if there was, no outsider would get access to it. Jessup didn't give up. He came back again, brought new documents, offered new terms for the division, explained that technically, without his company, no one would ever raise that gold at all. The argument worked. In 1981, all three parties signed an agreement: Great Britain, the USSR, and Jessup's consortium. The terms: 45% of the raised gold goes to the consortium as payment for the work. The remaining 55% is divided between the USSR and Great Britain in a 2/3 to 1/3 ratio. This was an unprecedented deal. The Soviet Union, at the height of the Cold War, signed a commercial agreement with a private Western company for the joint recovery of military property. Nothing like this had ever happened. But the recovery was still far off. First, they had to find the ship exactly, because approximate coordinates cover a very large square in the open sea. Jessup used a remotely operated underwater vehicle, a technology that in 1981 was still considered almost exotic. The vehicle descended to the depth and transmitted images to a monitor. They combed a huge area. April 1981. Cold. The sea is restless. Every day, new legs, new squares, new hours in front of the monitor. And then, one day, something big appeared on the screen. Very big. With the characteristic lines of a warship. With gun turrets. With a mast leaning to the side. One of the operators said quietly, "That's her." Silence filled the cabin for a few seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. The Edinburgh lay on its starboard side, 400 kilometers northeast of the Kola Gulf, exactly where Dean's notes indicated. The Ruve flew around the hull, filmed everything in detail. The bow section, where the first torpedo had left its mark, was partially buried in silt. The stern was more heavily destroyed. The hull as a whole was surprisingly well preserved. Almost 40 years underwater, and the silhouette was unmistakably recognizable. Jessup looked at the monitor for a long time. He thought about the divers who would have to go down there, about the darkness, about the pressure of 25 atmospheres, about the torpedoes that had lain in the water for 40 years, about the bodies of the fallen sailors who rested there. This was not just a technical task. It was something more. He closed his laptop, stood up, went out on deck. The Barents Sea around him was gray and cold, as always, but everything had changed. The gold was found. Now they had to go down and get it. And this was where the hardest part began. Depth, 245 meters. Let's stop for a second and understand what this means in practice. 245 meters is the height of an 80-story building. If you stood on the roof of such a building and looked down, that is the distance that separated the surface from the Edinburgh's hull. At this depth, water pressure is 25 atmospheres. This means, on every square centimeter of your body, there is a column of water weighing 25 kilograms. An ordinary diver cannot go there. Physically impossible. In 1981, there were two ways to work at such a depth. First, remotely operated vehicles. They had helped find the ship, but were not suitable for manual labor. Second, saturation divers. A saturation diver is a person who lives under pressure. Literally. The system works like this. On board the ship is a special decompression chamber, a sealed steel cylinder. The divers go inside. The pressure inside the chamber is gradually raised to the level of the working depth, to 25 atmospheres. This process is called saturation. Saturation takes several days. Then the divers live in this chamber. Eat there, sleep there, talk there. Their voices at such pressure change beyond recognition, becoming high and squeaky due to the helium-oxygen mixture. A telephone unscrambler on the surface decodes their speech in real time. When it's time to work, the diver is moved into a special diving bell, a small capsule, also sealed. The bell is lowered on a cable to the ship's level. The diver goes outside and works, then returns to the bell. The bell is raised back to the decompression chamber. A work shift at depth is 6 hours. Decompression at the end of the operation takes several days. You can't do it fast. If you do, bends, decompression sickness, gas bubbles in the blood. It can kill. These were the conditions Jessup's divers had to work in. The team was carefully selected. Experienced saturation specialists. There were few of them in the world in 1981. There were 19 people in total, different nationalities, British, Norwegians, a few Americans. Before the operation began, each of them received a full briefing. They were told about the ship, about the damage, about where the gold was likely located, about the fact that the ship was a war grave, and about the torpedoes. Here, the briefing would pause. At the moment of its sinking, the Edinburgh carried a full combat load. 40 years in seawater does different things to explosives. No one knew exactly what had happened to the Edinburgh's ammunition. The instructor looked at the divers, spoke calmly. Don't touch the torpedoes. If you see one, go around. If you can't go around, report up. One of the divers asked, "What if the gold is right next to a torpedo?" A pause. Report up. We'll decide together. The operation began on May 9, 1981. The date was not chosen by chance. Soviet representatives insisted. For them, starting work on Victory Day mattered. This was their war. This was their gold. Soviet observers were on board the support ship, representatives of Ingolstadt. Their task was simple: count the ingots. Every raised ingot was recorded in documents on both sides, British and Soviet. mutual distrust within official cooperation. The Cold War in miniature. The first days were spent on preparation. The divers were saturated in the chamber. A cutting plan was made. It was decided not to blow up the hole. They slowly, carefully cut with special hydraulic tools. The first bell went down on May 16th. The diver stepped out into the water. The darkness was absolute. The lamp on his helmet threw a narrow beam, a few meters forward, no more. The water, near 0 degrees. The first thing the diver saw was the side of the cruiser. It stretched up and down beyond the reach of his light. Steel plates covered in 40 years of deposits. There was rust, but less than expected. The cold water slowed the process. Then the diver saw the hole from the first torpedo. The metal was torn outward, as if something had exploded from inside the ship. The edges were jagged, curled. You could enter the interior through the hole. On the first day, they didn't go inside, just inspected the exterior, mapped the exact dimensions of the hole, reported up. This was methodical work. No adventurism, no rush. Everything complicated the situation. Fuel oil, which over 40 years had saturated the entire interior, touch a wall, and a cloud of black, oily liquid instantly destroyed visibility. Silt on the hold floor, soft, sucking. Sharp edges of torn metal everywhere. And the torpedoes, they were there. The divers saw them. Long, cylindrical, covered in sediment. They lay motionless, silently, as if they were sleeping. No one knew how deeply. They worked around the clock, 3 shifts, 6 hours each. And then, on the 17th day of work, June 2nd, 1981, one of the divers, working in the cut-open hold, felt something in the silt. Heavy, dense, smooth. He cleared the silt around it with his hands. Slowly, brought his light closer. Yellow metal, an ingot, 11 kilograms, a Soviet stamp on the side. The diver was silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke 3 words into the microphone. His squeaky, pressure-distorted voice was broadcast to the surface. Silence stood on the ship for a few seconds. Then, the Soviet representative pulled out the documents and readied his pen. The real work was beginning. The first ingot was raised to the surface in a metal basket. The Soviet representative approached the basket, inspected the ingot, recorded the stamp number in his documents, signed. The British representative did the same in his documents. Ingot number 1, officially documented. The operation had begun. Next, the grind. Day after day, shift after shift, ingot after ingot. Let's go down with the divers. You enter the bell, a small space. Your partner is next to you. The door is sealed. The bell begins to descend. For the first few minutes, you can still see light from the surface, greenish, diffused. Then the light fades, gradually, as if someone is slowly turning a dimmer switch. And then comes the darkness. True darkness. Not the kind you're used to at home. Here, 0 light. The bell descends for 18 minutes. You hear only your own breathing. Loud, unnaturally loud. And the quiet hum of equipment. Sometimes, the creak of the cable. Sometimes, undefined sounds from outside that the water turns into something unrecognizable. Then the bell stops next to the Edinburgh's hull. You open the bottom hatch. The water beneath you is black, motionless. You turn on the light. The beam hits the side of the ship, 1 meter away, 2 meters. Steel, covered in 40 years of growth. You step out. You walk along the side to the hole in the bow. There it is. The edges of the torn metal vanish into the dark. Inside, blackness. You enter the Edinburgh. This is a moment all the divers describe the same way. The moment you cross the threshold of the ship. Outside, it's just water, just the bottom. Inside, you are in someone's history, in someone's death. Silt was everywhere, soft, gray-brown. Silt lay in a layer several dozen centimeters deep on all horizontal surfaces. The gold was in it. The boxes had long since rotted away completely. The wooden slats had turned into dust that mixed with the silt. The ingots lay scattered, some in a tight group where a box once stood, others flung, moved by the blast wave or simply shifted over decades. They had to be found by touch, literally. You drop to your knees in the silt, slowly, carefully, run your hand over the surface. Silt rises in a cloud. Visibility drops to zero. You work by memory, by the map, by feeling. And sometimes, your fingers hit something dense, heavy, smooth. Then you freeze. Very slowly, clear the silt around it. Raise your light. Yellow metal. You take the ingot with both hands, 11 kilograms. Place it in the basket, methodically, without celebration. Celebration comes later, on the surface. Now, only work. Next to you, your partner. You work together, occasionally exchanging short phrases. Mike Stewart, a former Royal Navy officer and the British operation lead, listens to every word. The Soviet representative stands nearby. The divers were forbidden from touching anything except the gold and direct obstacles. No souvenirs. No interference with anything that didn't concern the operation. The torpedoes lay where they lay. No one touched them. Several times it happened that an ingot was literally next to a torpedo, a meter away, half a meter away. Then the work slowed down. They moved even more carefully. Not a single torpedo went off. Whether they had truly stabilized over 40 years, or whether it was just luck. Fuel oil complicated the work. It saturated everything. Metal, silt, water. Touch a wall, and a cloud of black, oily liquid turned visibility to zero. Absolute zero. You stand in the dark, your light shining into a black murk. In those moments, you just have to wait. Don't move. Breathe evenly. The oil settles, slowly. 5 minutes. 10. Sometimes 15. This is psychologically harder than any physical load. Standing motionless in absolute darkness, in a dead ship, at a depth of 245 meters. Waiting. All the divers who worked on the Edinburgh described these moments as the hardest. The ingot count grew. 10, 20, 50, 100. The Soviet representative recorded each one. The British documents recorded each one. 2 parallel accounts, 2 signatures on every ingot. And here, something happened that is written very briefly in the official reports. One day, the count didn't match. According to Stewart's documents, 1 number. According to the Soviet side, another. Difference, 1 ingot. They investigated for a long time, several hours. Both representatives sat with the documents, checking the entries. The tension on board became palpable. In the end, they agreed. They found a discrepancy in the records, an error in numbering. But for several hours, everyone thought of one thing, and no one said it out loud. Then, work continued. By the end of the season, in October 1981, the divers had raised 431 ingots, 5,129 kilograms, almost everything. The weather stopped the work. The Barents Sea in autumn is not a place where you want to tempt fate. The ship headed for shore. It was quiet on board, a tired silence. People who had worked at their limit for several months just sat and were silent. Mike Stewart went out on deck, looked back, to where the Edinburgh remained underwater. 34 ingots were still lying there. It was decided to leave them for the next season. In 1986, they returned. They got 29 more. 5 remained there forever. 55 kilograms of gold. In the darkness, in the silt, in the dead ship on the bottom of the Barents Sea. Not because they couldn't find them, because the economics were simple and cruel. The cost of an expedition for 5 ingots exceeded the value of the ingots themselves. Stuart stood for a little while longer. Then he went back inside. Behind his back, the sea was gray and completely indifferent, as if nothing had happened. The sea never remembers anything, but people remember. And now we have the last part of this story to tell, about where the gold went, about what happened to the people, and about one ingot that ended up in the most unexpected place on Earth. Autumn, 1981, London. 431 ingots of Soviet gold arrived in Great Britain in sealed containers under guard. This time, everything was official. The press already knew. The world already knew. The story of the Edinburgh had become public. And here began, perhaps, the most unexpected act of this entire story. Not military, not diving, financial. Let's calculate. 5,129 kilograms of gold. In October 1981, the market price of a troy ounce was about $450. Total, roughly $74 million. In 1981 prices. Today, those same ingots would be worth more than 3 times as much. The agreement fixed shares and percentages of what was raised. Jessup's consortium, 45%. Payment for work, equipment, and risk. The remaining 55% was divided between the USSR and Great Britain. The Soviet side received 2/3. The British, 1/3. The consortium received ingots worth about $33 million. The USSR, about $27 million. Great Britain, about $14 million. But there was context. In 1942, the USSR sent this gold as payment for military supplies. Weapons that had already been received, already used. This gold was already spent, theoretically. It was an obligation that had not been fulfilled because of the war and the ship's sinking. Did the British receive compensation for an unfulfilled obligation? Lawyers debated this question for a long time. The official answer was blurred. When the gold was raised in 1981, it turned out that the market price had changed over those months. Gold in the 80s jumped in price very noticeably. The initial calculations were built on one set of quotes. The final division took place on another. This suited Jessup's consortium. They received more than they had planned. The Soviet side did not comment publicly. However, within the Soviet delegation, the mood was special. This was gold that had gone to war. That was supposed to become tanks and planes. And now, part of it was returning, but no longer to the state that had sent it. That state, that system, no longer existed in its former form. Soviet representatives accepted the ingots methodically, counted them, signed, loaded them into containers. One of them, according to Stuart's memories, held an ingot in his hands for a long time before putting it in the box. Just held it, looked at the stamp, then put it down, said nothing. Stuart didn't ask what he was thinking. Some things are understood without words. The British share went into the state treasury, without much publicity. A few articles in financial newspapers, a few questions in Parliament, and silence. The Soviet share went back into the state reserve. The exact route of the ingots movement is not public information. But one ingot went a different way. It was transferred to the Diamond Fund of the Russian Federation. The Diamond Fund is not just a vault of valuables. It is a place where the history of the country is gathered in material form. The crown of the Russian Empire, the scepter with the Orlov diamond, orders, jewels, unique nuggets. And there, among all this magnificence, an ingot from the hold of a British cruiser. No decorations, no diamonds, just an ingot. But it tells more than everything else in that hall, because the crown has a parade history. This ingot has a different one. It was cast during wartime, carried through a country that was bleeding out. Loaded at night in a port under bombing, carried on a ship that was heading toward its doom. It lay for 40 years in the dark, next to the bodies of sailors and unexploded torpedoes. It was found in the silt, by touch, by a man in a diving suit. This ingot saw the war from the inside, not the parade side, the real one. Keith Jessup gave several interviews after the operation, spoke with restraint, but one question clearly touched him. Journalist asked, "How did you feel when you realized you found the gold?" He answered roughly the same every time. "We didn't find gold. We found a ship." A pause. The gold was just the reason to go down. In his archive, they found one photograph, a monitor showing the Edinburgh's hull on the bottom, and next to it, Stewart. He's looking at the screen, the expression on his face, not triumph, not joy, something like recognition, as if he met someone he had been looking for a long time. One of the divers said briefly, "I remember this phrase. There was a feeling that the ship knows you've come, that she was waiting." This sounds strange coming from a man who spends his life working with metal and pressure, but he said exactly that. In 1992, the British government officially placed a memorial plaque at the site of the Edinburgh's sinking. It was lowered to the bottom by an ROV. It lies on the cruiser's hull to this day. Moscow, the Diamond Fund of the Russian Federation. Imagine walking into this hall, the line at the entrance, the ticket, the audio guide, security, glass display cases with lighting, tourists with phones. In the first case, the crown of the Russian Empire, 4,936 diamonds, 383 years of history. It was made for a coronation, for parade, for majesty. You walk further, and somewhere in this hall, among all this magnificence, lies a rectangular piece of yellow metal. No decorations, no diamonds, just an ingot, 11 kilograms, a Soviet stamp. Scratches on the side. From what exactly, no one can say now. Maybe from the edge of the box during loading in Murmansk. Maybe from a metal bulkhead when the blast wave threw it across the hold. Maybe from the hands of the diver who felt it in the silt. This ingot wasn't created for a museum. It was created for war. Let's stop for a second and trace the entire path of this piece of metal from the very beginning. Somewhere in the Soviet depths, gold-bearing ore was mined, smelted, cast into a standard form, stamped, packed in a wooden box. It was 1941, the year the country was losing 1 million soldiers a month. The ingot was carried by train through a country in ruins, through cities bombed every night, through forests where battles were still raging, to Murmansk. In Murmansk, it was loaded onto a ship, at night, fast, without documents. On this ship, it was carried as a payment, as an obligation, as evidence that a country bleeding out still pays its bills. Then, a torpedo, explosion, darkness, and 40 years of silence at a depth of 245 meters. Then, hands in diving gloves, a basket, an ascent through 18 minutes of darkness, light on the surface. Then, London, division, transport, Moscow, and a display case in the Diamond Fund. This entire journey took 43 years. I've thought about this ingot for a long time, tried to understand why it was placed exactly there, in a hall with crowns and scepters. Maybe the answer is simple. The crown speaks of who they wanted to appear to be. The ingot speaks of who they actually were. A country that, in the darkest year of its history, found gold and sent it through Arctic waters, under torpedoes, through the death of ships and men, to get tanks and planes in return. This is not majesty on parade. This is a different kind of majesty. Less beautiful, more real. But I want to speak of something else as well. About the Edinburgh. The ship still lies there. At a depth of 245 meters, 400 kilometers northeast of the Kola Gulf, she lies on her starboard side, exactly as she settled in 1942, slowly decaying. But the silhouette is still recognizable. Next to her, a plaque with the names of the 58, and 5 ingots in the silt, the last ones. Those they decided not to raise. Sometimes I think about those 5 ingots, about the fact that they were left not because of technical difficulty. In the end, that is solvable. They were left because the math was against them. 55 kilograms of gold. In today's money, several $1 million. Not such a small amount, but no one raised them. Maybe that is right. Let's talk about the people. Admiral Stuart Bonham Carter, the man who commanded the Edinburgh in its final days, who gave the order to evacuate the crew and left the bridge last, with a shard in his leg, died in 1972, 9 years before the gold was raised. He never knew the gold was found. Lieutenant Commander Teichert, the commander of U-456 who fired those 2 torpedoes, fought for another year, received the Knight's Cross. In May 1943, his submarine was sunk by a British aircraft in the Atlantic. He was 29 years old. He never knew about the gold on board the Edinburgh. For him, it was just a combat mission, just a target in the Periscope. War doesn't ask what exactly you sunk. Keith Jessup, the man who found the ship and raised the gold. When asked which operation was the most important in his career, he always named the Edinburgh. Not because it was the most profitable, because it was the most real. Mike Stewart, after the Edinburgh, wrote a book about the operation, Restrained, Precise, a naval officer to the core. But in the last chapter, just a few lines, he wrote about what he thought when he looked from the deck at the site of the Edinburgh's sinking. He wrote that he thought of the 58, of those who stayed there, that the gold was raised, but they were not. I started this story with the image of one ship in Arctic water, alone, at top speed, with a secret in its hold. She was heading home. She didn't make it. But the story of her made it. Through 80 years, through archives and declassified documents, through the memories of survivors, it made it to us.